On April 24, 1915, the Ottoman government arrested and executed hundreds of Armenian intellectuals in a single night. Within 18 months, up to 1.5 million people were dead. Adolf Hitler would later cite this as proof that he could get away with it. The Ottoman Empire at the turn of the 20th century was a state in the process of dying, slowly, painfully, and with considerable violence. For decades, it had been losing territory, losing wars, and losing the ethnic and religious coherence that its rulers believed had once held it together. The word that circulated in European capitals was the sick man of Europe. Inside the empire, that sickness was increasingly being blamed on minorities. The Armenian population, Christian, educated, economically active, and concentrated in the eastern provinces, had lived inside the Ottoman system for centuries. They paid taxes, served in commerce, ran schools and churches, and by most measures were a functioning part of the empire's social fabric. They were also, in the eyes of an increasingly nationalist Ottoman leadership, a problem to be solved. The Committee of Union and Progress, known in the West as the Young Turks, came to power in 1908, promising modernization and constitutional reform. By 1913, after a coup, they had consolidated control. By 1915, with the empire at war on multiple fronts, they had decided that the Armenians would not survive the conflict. The mechanism was deportation. Armenians were ordered to leave their homes, their villages, their cities, ostensibly for relocation to the Syrian interior. What followed the deportation orders was not relocation. It was death by design, starvation on forced marches, massacre by irregular forces, drowning in rivers, burning in buildings. The killing units, drawn largely from released convicts and tribal irregulars organized into the Special Organization, were explicitly tasked with ensuring that the deportees did not arrive. The escalation was systematic. It moved province by province. In April 1915, it was the intellectuals in Constantinople. By summer, it was the general population of Anatolia. By 1916, entire communities that had existed for 2,000 years had been erased. Estimates of the dead range from 600,000 to 1.5 million, with most serious historians placing the figure above 1 million. The survivors scattered across the Middle East, Europe, and the Americas. The communities that remained were broken beyond recovery. This actually happened documents history's worst chapters, the well-known and the forgotten, to understand what they reveal about power, human nature, and civilization. Because history demands to be remembered. On the night of April 23rd into the early hours of April 24th, 1915, a man named Grigoris Balakian was asleep in his home in Constantinople. He was a bishop of the Armenian Apostolic Church, a theologian, and a respected figure in the capital. He was also, by the standards of the Ottoman Interior Ministry under Talat Pasha, a name on a list. Before sunrise, soldiers came. Balakian was arrested along with somewhere between 235 and 270 other Armenian intellectuals, clergy, editors, doctors, and political figures, rounded up in a single coordinated sweep across the city. Most of them were taken to a prison outside Constantinople. Most of them were dead within weeks. That night is the reason April 24th is marked as Armenian Genocide Remembrance Day, observed this week by Armenians around the world. Not because the killing began that night. Organized massacres had already been underway in the eastern provinces, but because that night represented the moment the Ottoman government moved to destroy the intellectual and civic leadership of the Armenian community, before the larger extermination became impossible to deny. Balakian survived. Most of the others did not. To understand how this happened, you have to understand what the Ottoman Empire had become by 1915, and what its ruling faction believed it needed to become. The empire had spent the previous 4 decades losing: the Russo-Turkish War of 1877, the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913. In those 2 Balkan Wars alone, the empire lost roughly 83% of its remaining European territory, and several 100,000 Muslims were killed or displaced. The Young Turk leadership watched this happen and drew a specific conclusion. The empire's survival required ethnic and religious homogeneity. Minorities, in this framework, were not citizens with divided loyalties. They were existential threats. This was not a fringe position. It was the governing ideology of the three men who ran the empire: Talat Pasha at the Interior Ministry, Enver Pasha commanding the military, and Jamal Pasha controlling Syria. They are known in history as the Three Pashas, and by 1915, they had total authority over what happened next. The specific trigger was the war. When the Ottoman Empire entered World War I in November 1914, on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, it immediately faced catastrophic military losses. In January 1915, at the Battle of Sarikamish on the Russian front, the Ottoman Third Army, commanded personally by Enver Pasha, was destroyed. Of roughly 90,000 troops, approximately 75,000 died, most from frostbite and starvation rather than combat. Enver needed an explanation that wasn't his own command failures. The Armenians, Christian, with ethnic and linguistic ties to Russia, became the explanation. Here's what makes this stranger still. The accusation of Armenian disloyalty was not supported by evidence. The Armenian population had, on the whole, complied with Ottoman conscription. The major Armenian political organizations had not coordinated with Russia. A small group of Armenians did fight alongside Russian forces, as did some Kurds, Greeks, and others. But the idea of an organized Armenian fifth column was largely a fabrication constructed after the military disaster to justify what the leadership had already decided to do. The decision, the evidence now suggests, preceded the justification. In February and March of 1915, before the deportation orders became public, the Ottoman War Ministry began disarming Armenian soldiers serving in the military, removing them from combat units and placing them in labor battalions, where many were later executed. The special organization, the killing units, was being assembled in the same months. The telegraph infrastructure used to coordinate the deportations was in place before the formal orders arrived. This was not improvised panic. This was planning. The deportation orders began arriving in the eastern provinces in April and May of 1915. The language used was bureaucratic and careful. Communities were to be relocated to more suitable areas for reasons of military security. Local officials who asked for clarification received it by telegraph from Talat Pasha's office directly. What the orders actually set in motion was this: Armenian men were typically separated from their families and killed first, shot in groups, often at the edge of ravines or rivers outside of town. Women, children, and the elderly were then formed into columns and marched south and east into the Syrian desert. The marches covered hundreds of miles. There was no food provided. There was no shelter. The gendarmerie escorts did not protect the columns from the irregular forces, the special organization units and tribal Kurdish raiders, who attacked them repeatedly along the route. Women were abducted. Children were taken or abandoned. The elderly collapsed and were left. The destination, in theory, was resettlement camps in the Syrian interior near Deir ez-Zor. What existed there, for those who survived the march, was a desert plateau with no infrastructure, no food supply, and no realistic path to survival. A German military observer accompanying Ottoman forces, Ambassador Hans von Wangenheim, who reported back to Berlin, wrote explicitly that the deportations were not a military measure. They were, in his assessment, intended to destroy the Armenian population. Germany, as the Ottoman Empire's wartime ally, received these reports and continued the alliance. That detail sits with you once you know it. The death toll accumulated across 18 months, with a geographic thoroughness that distinguishes deliberate extermination from the incidental casualties of war. Province by province: Van, Bitlis, Erzurum, Diyarbakir, Harput, Sivas. Ancient Armenian communities that had existed for millennia, gone within a single campaign season. In some regions, local Ottoman officials refused the deportation orders and were replaced. In others, they participated enthusiastically and enriched themselves with confiscated Armenian property. The confiscation was also systematic. Armenian homes, businesses, churches, and schools were seized under the Abandoned Properties Laws of 1915. Legislation passed in May of that year to give legal cover to the expropriation. The property did not go back to Armenian owners after the war. It never did. And then it gets worse. Grigoris Balakian, the bishop arrested on April 24th, was eventually released through connections, survived the war in hiding, and wrote a memoir. He documented, in clinical detail, the bodies he saw along the roadsides, the villages emptied to silence, the rivers running with the dead. He named specific locations. He recorded specific conversations with the officials who had ordered the killings. His memoir was published in Armenian in 1922. For most of the 20th century, almost nobody outside the Armenian community read it. That is its own kind of answer about how erasure works, not only through violence, but through the indifference of the world that followed. The war ended in 1918. The Ottoman Empire collapsed. The three pashas fled to Europe on a German submarine. For a brief moment, it appeared that something like accountability was possible. The post-war Ottoman government, the Sultanate, now eager to distance itself from its Young Turk predecessors, convened military tribunals in 1919 and 1920. Talat, Enver, and Chamal were tried in absentia and sentenced to death. Dozens of officials were convicted. The proceedings documented, in Ottoman government's own words, the existence of a coordinated extermination policy. Those records existed. They were real. And then, systematically, they were buried. The Turkish nationalist movement under Mustafa Kemal, the future Ataturk, was already consolidating power by the time the tribunals concluded. The new Turkish Republic, founded in 1923, had no interest in inheriting criminal liability for the empire it had replaced. The tribunal convictions were quietly set aside. The documentation was suppressed. The official position that emerged, and that the Turkish state has maintained ever since, was that no genocide occurred, that Armenians died in the generalized chaos of wartime, as victims of disease and intercommunal violence, not of deliberate state policy. That position has now been maintained for over a century. What makes it worth examining carefully is not the denial itself. States protect their founding myths with considerable energy, but the specific mechanism of the denial. Because Turkey did not simply say nothing happened. It constructed an alternative account, that the deportations were a legitimate security measure, that the death toll was exaggerated, that Armenians had themselves committed violence against Turkish civilians, and that the use of the word genocide was a political weapon aimed at destabilizing a modern nation. Each element of this counter-narrative was designed to muddy water that was not actually murky. The word genocide itself, and this is the layered reveal this history has been building toward, was coined specifically because of the Armenian case. Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish jurist who spent years campaigning for international recognition of mass atrocities as a distinct legal category, has said explicitly that the Armenian extermination was one of the foundational cases he studied. He coined the term in 1944. The UN Genocide Convention was adopted in 1948, and yet, the convention's own enforcement mechanisms were so weak, and the political will to apply them so absent, that the crime Lemkin had partly built his framework around was never formally adjudicated in any international court with jurisdiction over the perpetrators. The Nuremberg trials established that crimes against humanity could be prosecuted. They did not reach back to 1915. They could not. But the precedent they set, and the moral architecture they were built on, owed a direct debt to what had happened to the Armenians, and to the world's failure to respond to it at the time. That debt has never been fully acknowledged. And then there is Hitler. On August 22, 1939, 8 days before the German invasion of Poland, Adolf Hitler addressed his military commanders at his Berghof retreat. The meeting was recorded by a German officer. More than one version of the transcript has survived, including the Lochner document, obtained by an American journalist, and historians debate the precise wording while broadly accepting its authenticity. In it, Hitler dismissed concerns about the brutal treatment of Polish civilians with a question that was not really a question. The exact wording varies across the surviving document versions. The Lochner document and the official German record differ in their phrasing. But the historical consensus is that Hitler said something very close to this and meant exactly what it implied. He had studied the Armenian case, He understood that the Ottoman government had organized the systematic destruction of a population, that its architects had died not in prison cells, but in flight, that the world had moved on within a generation, and that the absence of punishment was itself a kind of permission. He was not wrong. That is an uncomfortable sentence to write, but the evidence supports it. The Armenian genocide was not a warning to future perpetrators. It was, in the precise and terrible sense, a precedent. The question this history asks, the one that doesn't go away, is not simply how the killing happened. The mechanisms of mass atrocity, once you have studied enough of them, follow recognizable patterns. The dehumanization, the bureaucratic language, the gradual escalation from discrimination to deportation to murder. The harder question is what allowed it to be forgotten. Part of the answer is strategic. The Turkish Republic was a useful Cold War ally. The United States, NATO members, and Israel all maintained official positions, for decades, that avoided using the word genocide in deference to Turkish sensitivities. The diplomatic calculation was explicit. Acknowledging the genocide would strain the alliance, so it was not acknowledged. This was not confusion. This was a choice made by governments that knew the historical record. Individual countries began formally recognizing the Armenian genocide across the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st. France recognized it in 2001. The United States Congress passed a resolution in 2019. President Biden became the first sitting American president to formally use the word genocide in official remarks on April 24, 2021. Turkey recalled its ambassador each time a new recognition occurred. As of today, Turkey still officially denies the genocide. It has not prosecuted anyone for the denial. It has prosecuted its own citizens under Article 301 of the Turkish Penal Code, which criminalizes insulting Turkishness for publicly calling it what it was. The novelist Orhan Pamuk, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature, was charged under that law in 2005 after telling a Swiss newspaper that 30,000 Kurds and 1 million Armenians had been killed in Turkey. The charges were eventually dropped under international pressure. The law remains. Grigoris Balakian survived the war, eventually emigrated, and died in the United States in 1934. His memoir, published in Armenian in 1922, was not translated into English until 2009, 90 years. That gap is not accidental. It reflects the particular fate of a genocide that was not incorporated into the dominant historical memory of the 20th century, that did not become the reference point the way the Holocaust became the reference point. In part because the political conditions for acknowledgement were never created, and in part because the survivors were a diaspora without a state of their own to insist on remembrance. The state of Armenia did not exist until 1991. The Soviet Republic before it observed April 24th cautiously, without international amplification. The diaspora observed it in their communities, in their churches, in their languages, and largely in private. What this history reveals about power is specific, that states are capable of organizing the murder of their own populations with administrative precision, and that other states are capable of watching it happen, documenting it, and doing nothing, and then, when the killing is finished, doing something arguably worse. They forgave the killers by simply refusing to name them. The Armenian genocide is not primarily a story about human capacity for violence. That capacity is well documented across history and requires no further demonstration. It is a story about what happens after, about how institutions, alliances, and political convenience construct the silence that follows atrocity, and how that silence becomes its own kind of policy. A crime that goes unnamed can be repeated. That is not a philosophical claim. It is an empirical one, documented in the events of the 20th century that followed 1915 with such relentless frequency. The first genocide of the modern era was also, in the most precise sense, a lesson that the world failed to learn, and then watched others study instead. If this episode made you think differently, subscribe. New episodes every week. And if you want to go deeper, there's more waiting for you.